Many of you heard Brendon at the Elder Deacon retreat. How many of you heard that? Oh, that's why. Well, and that explains why he came back. He did a tremendous job, and we're really excited to have him do this. If you don't know, he's a professor of religion. His main area is in what some would call Old Testament, some would call Hebrew Bible. At William Jewell, also associated with the Center for Faith and Culture, which of course is associated with Yale and Maristoff, and we know a lot of that. And so we're really glad to have him for 4 weeks, and he's going to tell you more about what's coming up tonight and in the weeks to come, including some homework. No grading that we know of. Pass fail. So anyway, please help me welcome Dr. Brendon Benz.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. It's great to see you. It's great to see some of you again. And some of you are aware of my eye issue, so if I don't recognize you, it's not about you. It's about me. I have 2 sons. One is now 13 and the other's 10. And when the 10-year-old Jack, very passionate guy, knows how to point out injustice quite well and fights for justice, which is great. When he was about 3 or 4, we were driving in the car and I had a Gatorade that I was drinking, and he says, from the back seat, both me and his brother are in the back seat riding together, and he says, "Dad, can I have some Gatorade?" And I was hesitant because you know what's going to inevitably happen, right? He's going to try to take a drink from this big bottle and it's going to spill all over him. And I said, "Jack, I'll let you have some, but you have to be really, really careful, okay?" I hand it back to him, and he takes a drink, and sure enough, I hear whining, and he spilled it all over the front of the shirt. I'm like, "Jack." And his older brother looks at him and says, "Jack, you gotta listen to the commercial. You gotta learn to drink responsibly." Which parenthetically has a lot to do with the Bible. So we're going to talk about this week and the next 3 weeks. We're going to look at 3 biblical texts closely. One is Genesis 1 through 3, which are the creation narratives. One is 6 through 9, which is the flood narrative. And the other is John 20. We'll wrap it up with John 20. And I really want to kind of investigate together our sense of what the Bible is, who God is, and why the Bible. All right. And just to put it out there, first of all, I had such a great time at the Elder Deacon meeting because people were so interactive, and that makes the night, that makes the afternoon, right? Mike knows this. Students who interact are the best students in the world, which means your ideas and your experiences and your perceptions are more than welcome. And your questions, we can wrestle together with those. Does it make sense? There are wrong answers, let's just be clear. And as I like to tell my students, you cannot be whatever you want. I didn't learn that until 20 years of trying out for the Chiefs. I'm not good enough to be a cornerback or a professional football player for that matter. I know that sounds mean, especially this day and age. So don't be afraid of giving ideas. And some questions were raised during our last meeting together that were excellent, the type of questions we want to address. So let's start out with these 3 questions. And the first one, why the Bible? And these are seem like ridiculous questions, right? That we would ask. But it's so important. These questions are so important for understanding how we're reading the text and the lenses that we're bringing to the text and how that can shape our interpretation of it. Does that follow? Martin Luther, the Reformed leader or the Protestant Reformation leader, one of his battle cries was sola scriptura, right? Scripture only, because the Catholic Church holds, as I understand it, holds tradition and scripture on par. And Luther was saying, no, we're holding scripture first. And that's a great idea. That's an impossible act. because we're all bringing our insights and our baggage to the text. And so it's helpful to be aware of those things so that we can return to the Bible and read it again for the first time to quote the title of the book. So, silly question, why the Bible?
Stories.
Whose stories?
Everybody in the Bible.
Okay. Good. Oh. Don't like that on my eyes. Good. What else? Yes.
It gives us a guide as to how we should live our lives.
Excellent. Oh, by the way, I'm a horrible speller. So if I spell something wrong, just let it go. I need somebody to invent a whiteboard that has a squiggly red line when I misspell something. So it is a guide. It is a guide. And I'm too old to change. It's all right. Anything else? Yes.
It helps us to know God.
Mhm.
God is.
Yep. So you said guide for life and also a guide for understanding who God is. Good. Any other thoughts? Yes.
People's relationship with God.
Yes. We need to know who God is in order to relate to God. Good.
Where did the laws go, like the 10 Commandments and things like that?
What do you mean? Where did they go?
Yeah, I mean, if you didn't have a Bible, then would you have those laws?
That's a great question. It's a great question. We read a book in our introductory course at Jewel called Consilience by Edward O. Wilson. You may be familiar with him. He's a naturalistic biologist, sociobiologist. And his idea is that everything, ethics, religion, culture, all stem from our genes, essentially. And so I posed the question to my class, then what is the moral imperative, right? What's preventing us, anyone from saying, if existence is about survival, then I need to do this to survive, which often means violence, right? He has this line that says the unfortunate thing about the inborn propensity to ethics is xenophobia, or the dark side of the inborn propensity to ethics is xenophobia. And I say, isn't xenophobia or the fear of others sometimes promote survival? It does sometimes. And so why is he saying it's a negative thing, right? There has to be something greater to my mind, because I haven't had that answer to my mind to say, this is the foundation. This is why. You can't make it up. It's great. Where else? Excellent. Other ideas?
Would be a bit of promotion of why this God and not other gods.
Good. Which connects to this one, yeah?
Maybe just reputation.
Reputation, what do you mean by that? Yeah.
Well, if anybody knows people, they will.
Yeah. No, I was just looking.
Sure.
What's that?
We might not know what's in the Bible.
They may not know what's in the Bible, but they'll know the Bible. Yeah. Anything else? I love Genesis 1 through 3 because Genesis 1 through 3 are the first chapters of the Bible, right? And they describe what? I'm sure you all know. Creation. What is that? Why is that so important to begin with the beginning? What does the creation narrative tell us? Or what should it be telling us? about what is it telling us?
Help us, King.
How things came to be. Absolutely.
About ourselves.
About ourselves. Yeah, about ourselves. Yes.
Well, and how creative it all is. I mean, how beautiful. Colors, complexity.
Yes. And if we know better who we are, what's that? How else does that inform our daily lives?
If we look at creation and we know why God, and we know God created you, it tells us about our relationship to the world that God has created. And it seems perhaps the beginning of stewardship.
That's absolutely right. You're familiar with Genesis 1, 6 times, and the 7th time God judges creation in what way? No, six times. 5 times, and then the 6th. God judges creation in what way? That's right. That's right. If we take that seriously, that only demands that we steward God's creation, right? And too often these notions of, we're going to get into this later, these notions of God, the world is going to be destroyed at the end days, right? At the end times, these apocalyptic visions, which comes through a misreading of the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation too often. And this gives people license to mistreat the world. But God's intention is that it's good. And we view it the same way. That's right. So our relationship to God, our relationship to nature, and our relationship to what else?
Each other.
That's it.
Also, there was earlier a statement like this God.
Mm-hmm.
But if we look at other religions, God is not a different entity. It's the prophet.
It's true.
A different entity. So I never think of why this God. I think why these prophets.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That's right. And the Jewish tradition in particular acknowledges a God who works with and through other nations.
Mm-hmm.
The book of Amos, the prophetic book of Amos, it's being articulated during a time when the country of Israel, the nation of Israel, was wealthy, and it was politically strong, militarily strong, and the people thought because of that strength, God was blessing them. It's this election theology gone awry, therefore we can do whatever we want. And they were upholding the idea that God delivered us from Israel, we are chosen. And the prophet says, you're not that great. I also, God speaking to the prophet, I also brought up the Arameans, and I brought out the Ethiopians, which is this astounding statement, right? That God's working with these other people. And so God is revealing the divine self or God's self in different ways. And we could hear that voice, but there are differences, right? While we can find points of continuity, there are differences. We can't seek to level those differences out. We have to acknowledge those differences. This is good. This is good. When God created humanity, God said it was what? Good, okay? I grew up a Lutheran, and I was reminded every day how bad it was. You know what I mean? At least I wasn't a Presbyterian, right? Totally depraved. While we may have depravity, while we may be inclined toward evil, we're still good, right? Doesn't that shape the way you view yourself in a different way and the way you treat other people? If you say, I'm really actually pretty good. It's the difference between saying to my sons, what's a good word I can use? You are being selfish and you are selfish, right? They're not selfish inherently, I don't think. I think they're inclined toward that, but they don't have to. Anything else? This is all good, all correct. Yes.
If you look at the New Testament, to me, the New Testament is more about love. And God loves us. And why would you read it if you only read the Old Testament? You think about things, but when you read the New Testament, it proves it.
Okay. Good. Good. Perfect. It's like it's emphasis. We'll go back to that in a minute. See, I'm changing markers, which means we're changing topics. Okay. What's the level of biblical literacy, do you think, in the church? High or low? Or moderate? Because they're negative. That's good. This, yeah, what do you think?
A lot of people low, I would say low.
I think that's somewhat ironic, right?
You're talking about this church or the church?
The church, not this church. I would never talk about this church. I know, right? Here, I'll let the pulpit. You guys are just genius, brilliant. But you get my point, right? We all agree with these things, and I think most Christians do. The Bible is the core of our faith. It is. It's the foundation of our religion. It tells us who God is and who we are, what nature is, and how we're to relate to God and ourselves and others in nature. And yet, we're at a disadvantage. Sometimes we don't take the text as seriously as we can. Does that follow? Okay. All right. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take pictures of this so that I can erase. Everybody got that emblazoned in your minds? Okay. What is the Bible? Excellent statement. Old Testament versus New Testament. What else? Or we can just go to this one too. Who is God? And look, I don't want you to just say what you think, but what you've been told, or what you've been raised to believe, or what you've heard, right? Does that make sense? What are some of the common statements about who God is that are bandied about? You follow what I mean? Well, we can go back and forth.
I was going to say, some people would say that the Bible is the word.
Yes. What does that mean? An inerrant word of God?
Let's spell that right. Misspelling error.
I should, actually. Here. Inerrant. What does it mean to be inerrant? What's the other word that's often associated with inerrant? What does that mean? I know there's a nuance between them. I never really got the nuance, but what does that mean?
Omnipotent.
What's that?
Omnipotent.
Excellent.
And all of it means ultimate.
What are some of the other, well, first of all, let's do this. What does inerrant and infallible mean? No mistakes. Good.
It is infallible, it never lets you down, it never fails.
That's right. Which is an interesting nuance we could embrace, but mistakes. Good. What else? We'll address all of these. We'll address these.
God is all loving.
Okay. What was the other thing I heard?
The other two roles, present and mission.
Yeah. What does omniscient mean? Good. So omnipotent, all powerful. When I go through these with my class, I ask them just think about being all powerful.
And in the Old Testament,
All present and all knowing, yes.
I would say God is us.
God is us. What do you mean by that?
I'm sorry, what do I mean by that?
Yeah.
God has no ability to do anything unless we do something. And so it has to be all through us.
Source of all being.
Source of all being. There's I Am Thou by Martin Buber, right? One of the best passages. He says, you know with all of your being that you need God. But don't you know that God needs you? In God's very existence, God needs you. I love that because it subverts some of these ideas. We'll get back to that. Somebody else is going to say something.
in the Old Testament, God is also the ultimate punisher.
Okay. And how would you contrast that with the New Testament?
Well, Jesus has asked us to forgive one another when we're errant rather than cutting off a finger or stabbing out an eye. Jesus represents a loving reconciliation rather than punishment or vengeance, which the Old Testament seems vengeful rather than just punishment.
You're gonna be there? All right.
And I'm not sure that our Jewish brethren see it that way at all.
Okay.
I mean, I think they view God and God reflected therein as very loving.
So let's talk about that. This distinction. We as Christians we were raised with this distinction, Old Testament versus New Testament, right? And it's been great. In fact, we say, if you're going to read the Bible, where do you start? New Testament. It's like this. New Testament scholars over here. Yeah, start with the New Testament. I was raised Lutheran, as I said before. Old Testament is what? Law. New Testament is what? Grace, right? I mean, I went through catechism. That's what I learned. And it was not until I started actually reading the Bible and reading it in a critical way that I began to see what you're saying, that's not necessarily the dynamic that's going on, right? But we bring those lenses to the text. So Matthew 22, right, so start with this. There are moments in which God in the Hebrew Bible is vengeful. God calls the Babylonians to punish the Judeans. God calls the Assyrians to punish the Israelites. God says in Isaiah 45:7, I create light and darkness. I have made good and evil. This is true. There's a story of Jericho in the book of Joshua, right? But God is also very loving in the Hebrew Bible. God is really patient. Back to the book of Amos. Amos says to God, just hold back, will you? Just hold back, because Jacob's just too small. And God relents. God consistently relents in the Bible because of God's love for humanity. Is the New Testament all peace? Now I'm treading on dangerous water. I don't want to misinterpret it, but my favorite is Matthew 22. This is a parable that Jesus is giving. And it's the parable of the wedding party. And the king sends out messengers, right, to the city people, city folk, and they reject his messengers to the point where I think he sends his son in this one as well, and they even kill his son. And word gets back to the king, and the king says, well, then go invite like the poor people to the wedding. But before that, go and do what to the city? Go destroy the city and kill all its inhabitants. Good. Jesus does drive people out of the temple. Jesus was also very wise, and he knew that if he took up swords against the Roman army, you would lose, right? It was not any time to do that. Yeah.
Well, what you've done is, under the what is the Bible, Dr. Graves has been telling us many times the Bible is a book of books, a library of books.
Yeah.
It's not a single. So as you were just saying, different things happen at different times, different places, and different perspectives. That all has to be dealt with as we read the Bible.
But the Bible was written by humans.
Right. So context is the key, right? My son was perfectly correct in interpreting a commercial for his 3-year-old brother and saying you need to learn to drink responsibly. But he was wrong in the intention that the authors had for that statement, right? That's the context. Context is key. And so this is what's interesting about the Bible too, is that it wasn't given to a single person at a single moment in time, but it was written over a long stretch of history, addressing different contexts and different people and their concerns, which to my mind says that the God of this text is a relational God. God wants to be present and wants to speak to people in their own context. And to the point about the human authors, well, what does it mean to get it right? What does it mean to get it wrong? Somebody's going to say something else.
What language does God speak?
American.
I mean, trying to figure out what it says.
God is not a person.
If he speaks English, then he tells them, no, the Hebrew says this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that brings up a good point too with this whole idea of inerrancy and infallibility. Most of the Bibles that we're reading are translated. Translations always require choice. And so it's impossible, and from that stage alone, to not have different readings. It's all interpretation, yes? And then we have many different manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, and there are many variations within those manuscripts. Same thing with the New Testament. There are like 200,000 variations from the New Testament manuscripts. And so if anybody says, do you believe that the Bible is inerrant, you need to ask them, which version of the Bible are you talking about? You follow what I'm saying?
King James.
That's right. That's it. That's right.
So just a side note, within the Jewish tradition, are there versions of today's Living Torah or the New English Torah? Are there variations of that within the Jewish tradition?
Certainly different translations, right? And then there's a lot of manuscript evidence. So they're relying upon different manuscripts. So I brought this. This is a Hebrew Bible. And you can see here the notes at the bottom of each page. And the vast majority of these notes that I'll show you are flipped through. These down here, these are variations in manuscripts. And every page has a multitude of those. Follow. And scholars do their best, but things change over time, right? But that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's part of the text as a living text. My favorite example of this is in Jeremiah 25. Jeremiah is the prophet writing to the exiles in Babylon who are having a time of it, right? Because they've just lost their land, they just lost their political structure. It looks like they just lost their God. They're saying, it's okay. Marry, build houses, start businesses, In 70 years you'll return. The fullness of time you'll return. And sure enough, about 7 years later, it returned.
I think we should say too that it's a collection of books that were canonized by people who wanted books that agreed with the way they felt.
Sure. Which book did Martin Luther not want in the canon? You know?
I guess so.
He loved Hebrews because Hebrews is all about what? It's all about faith. Tamar. So Tamar was saved by her faith. Then there's the book of James. And James talks about faith being dead without works. And the very same, not Tamar. Hagar. Rahab from Jericho. Rahab was saved by her faith in Hebrews. Rahab is saved by her actions in James. What a rich text that can have two claims that are polar opposites stand side by side. We as enlightened people, particularly as Christians, we want the right answer. A priest and a rabbi were driving in a car going to a conference, and they were arguing about to whom God first revealed the divine name. Was it Enoch, or was it Abraham, or was it Moses? And the rabbi is saying it's this or this, and the priest is saying it's that. And fortunately, they get into a car accident. They find themselves both in heaven, which is a great thing. And God comes and greets them, the non-being God or the non-person God. And they say, before we can go into heaven, we got to resolve this question. To whom did you first reveal your name? And God says, to Enoch, to Moses, and to Abraham. Mm-hmm. And the rabbi's like, yeah. And the priest is, but there has to be one, right? The complexity of the Bible demands this flexibility, this contextual understanding, yeah? And so it's so fun. People like to point to contradictions in the Bible to talk about how it's inauthentic, how it doesn't hold authority or shouldn't hold authority, but it's the contradictions that make it so rich. I don't know about your life, but my life is a living contradiction. And some of that's like good, right? I act around y'all in a different way that I act around other people. That's okay. Yeah? Okay, fine. Do you see how this we're bringing baggage to the text with this? You see that there's other baggage we could talk about? Yeah.
The Old Testament is all to Jewish people. The New Testament.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny when we start digging into the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, we begin to see that one of the governing themes is this idea that you are all disparate people. You don't like each other. If you read the book of Judges, they don't like each other at all. You fight more than you are friends. But at the table of Yahweh, at the table of God, you're brothers and sisters, right? Paul picks this up. Specifically in Galatians, it says the same thing, but that's a trajectory of the Hebrew Bible that's covered over a little bit by the biblical narrative of the Jewish people, of the Israelite people, but you can see it as you begin to pull it apart. Does that make sense? All of that? Great insight. Of course, in the New Testament, God becomes human, right? In the person of Jesus, God is incarnational. We have so many occasions, several occasions where God incarnates with the people in the Hebrew Bible, right? My favorite is Genesis 18, when God walks with Abraham, when looking at Sodom and Gomorrah, they have this dialogue, this debate, essentially. God is incarnational in the Hebrew Bible. All right, other thoughts?
Is usually anthropomorphic.
Yes. Usually anthropomorphic, takes on human characteristics, human forms. This is, of course, reflected most obviously or evidently in Jesus, the incarnation and stuff.
Is that seems to be distinctive if we think of mythology.
Yes.
And other cultural stories of creation, which their God is not.
Yeah. It's a good question. Certainly in Islam, God is not, right? And that's a pretty significant difference between the Hebrew Bible and the Quran. Where God does not condescend in that way. God does not condescend in that way. That's a powerful statement, though, right? That God becomes human. You said something else. You said myth. Good word or a bad word when it comes to the Bible?
It's a great word.
Okay, very. Why do you say that?
Because otherwise, anybody who has any kind of scientific bent at all couldn't read the Bible. I mean, I can, when I think about it as a myth with a lot of meaning to it, it's still myth.
Okay.
It makes sense to me, but it doesn't make sense to me if somebody's trying to tell me it's not really true. I don't buy it.
Okay. Literally true. This is the literally.
But that doesn't mean it isn't true. It's just not literally true. It has a lot of truth to it.
That's right. We have this misunderstanding. We often bring this misunderstanding, and this is where these terms come into play, right? If it's not literally, factually true, then it does not hold authority. Yeah? And this is where we begin arguing for creationism, that the first two books of the Bible are depicting how creation unfolded as it actually did some 6,000 years ago. Yes? Because if it doesn't, then we can't trust it. Make sense? What's the most important holiday of the year?
Easter.
No,
Easter.
It's okay. As long as you get a lot of basket trees. Yes.
Christmas, yes.
Got it. Valentine's Day. Excellent. Valentine's Day. You're going to learn with me to just throw out the most absurd. Valentine's Day. I'm gonna give you a little treat. I wasn't planning on doing this, but I will recite to you a poem that I've written that I try to give to my beloved every year. Are you ready? You're allowed to take those. You can copy if you want. Dear fill in the blank. Her name's not fill in the blank, but you should probably put your person's name in there instead of mine, because that would work well. Dear fill in the blank. You are 5 feet, 8 inches tall. You have moderately brown hair that at times goes past your shoulders. You have a skull that has several holes in it. You have, in 2 of those holes, you have eyeballs lodged into them. You have a full set of teeth. I did this the other one. You have 2 arms and 2 legs. I love you. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? Because it's fully truthful, right? Like the Chiefs, 20 years of trying. That explains a lot. Why isn't it beautiful at all?
Yeah, scientific.
It's literally true, but there's no.
Right. At times, metaphor captures truth that fact cannot, right? In fact, very often, metaphor captures truth that is beyond objective realities. This is what the poet confesses when she uses metaphor, that I can't fully grasp it. So you are like this, but not quite. So you're also kind of like this, but I've fallen short here. and you are kind of like this, but again, I've fallen short. With historical, factual, scientific truth, we possess it. Yes, we possess it. We know it. We put our finger on it. That's the goal of science, to possess the truth. Metaphorical truth, religious truth, we always pursue it. We never fully possess it. And at the moment we confess, or the moment we say that we've possessed it, the moment we think we put our finger on it, it's like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. It flees, it floats away. We can't grasp it, you get it? Because possessing it, it leads to violence. I understand it, which means I need to tell you how to understand it. And usually it means that you need to understand it in a way that makes me more powerful and you less powerful, yeah? And so this idea that it has to be factual, literal truth gets in the way of encountering it for what it is. You know this in relationship. The minute you think you know a person, you begin to do violence to that person. You are selfish, not you are acting selfish. All of that. Context is important. Anything else? We bring our political presuppositions to it. You know what I mean? We're living in a time when war is breaking out. And if I'm a pacifist, then I bring pacifist readings to the text. And if I believe that violence is justified in some cases, I bring those readings to the text. Make sense? Joel Osteen, we're all big fans, right here? No? Okay. Meaning, if we think that God shows the divine blessing by giving us health and wealth, we bring that to the text. Okay. Anything else? What the Bible is.
Well, if you take that, then the Bible is what we want to think.
It can, the risk of that is very possible. That's right. The risk of that is very possible. I think there are a few core things in the text, though, that set parameters, establish parameters that we cannot, from which we cannot deviate. One of those is that God is incarnational, which means God is relational, right? Which means that God loves humanity enough to the point that God gives up God's position to live with us, to suffer with us, to die with us, to laugh with us, right? That has to be at the fore of our minds when we're interpreting the text. Does that follow? And I think we have that at the fore of our minds, for one. We are prevented from developing theologies like a health and wealth gospel. God demonstrated God's power by becoming weak, by becoming poor. That's not a critique of wealth, right? That's not a critique of power necessarily. It's a critique of the misuse of power and the misuse of wealth. I think that's fair to say. God created humanity. That means every single one of us is valuable. It doesn't matter what we look like, how we worship, what gender we are. God created the world, which means nature is valuable. We need to care for it, yeah.
Wild Sue.
Yes, that's right.
People online are asking you to help repeat some of their comments.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So if somebody in here asks them, that if you can repeat,
Got it. Yes,
they're not always here.
thanks. So God allows sin. God allows pain. Right? Pain is real. Suffering is real. And the Bible embraces that. Some of you have kids, and you wish that your children never felt pain. And did you allow them to make decisions that, to some degree, they had to wrestle with the consequences of that decision? Do you know what I mean? Why would you do that? Yeah. There's that too. Because you're not in omniscience. Because you're not omniscient. Because loving the other demands allowing them to have agency, right? Even if that agency means there could be negative consequences. Such a profound thing, right? So which gets us back to these. These are divine perfections. This question came up when we were meeting a few weeks ago. What's another divine perfection? It's a class, if you go to any theology book, and it will have a section on divine perfections. Any other perfection that you're aware of? What's that? Yes, holy. Just
I think the question itself, with the who in the front of it, implies that it's an individual.
That's a good one. Sovereign? What does that mean? Power overall, which would tie into this omnipotent notion, yeah.
Separate from omnipotent. So knowing.
Yep. So that would be the omniscient one. God is all knowing. Yep.
Loving it.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's the.
Immutable.
How about imminent and transcendent?
That's a very good one. That's a play that the statement was imminent, means above, and imminent, which means here, right? And transcendent above. In fact, Genesis 1 depicts a transcendent God, a God who speaks creation into being, a God who doesn't have physical interaction with humanity. There is a blessing. God does speak to humanity and blesses it, but not like in Genesis 2, where God is forming humanity out of the ground, breathing the breath of life into it, working with the man to find the appropriate partner for him. Another great statement, two very different depictions of God standing side by side, challenging us to hold that intention. Yeah. What's immutable? I heard it. What was it?
Doesn't change.
Doesn't change. That's right. Where do these ideas come from? What's that?
Humans.
Yeah. Well, humans in particular. This is so important to me because these perfections in particular cloud our vision so much, really cloud our vision of what's going on in the text. Where do these ideas come from?
Seminary professors.
That's right. That's why I teach at a college.
It also comes from original religious denominational structures.
That's right, absolutely.
Hoping.
Greek philosophy.
Got it, right there, Greek philosophy. So we have definitions of what is perfect, right? We can define perfect in different ways. And it's the Greeks who define perfection in this way. Because in particular, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, right? They're wrestling with a Greek religion that has gods that are like humans with superpowers, right? And they're saying, if we're going to talk about the category of God, we can't be talking about humans with superpowers. That's for the Marvelverse. We're talking about real perfection. And to be perfect, first of all, first and foremost, you have to be immutable. This is where the idea from Aristotle, the unmoved mover. You've heard of that phrase? Because if you change, what does that imply about your being?
You weren't perfect.
Good. Either you weren't perfect and you became more perfect or better, right? Or you were perfect and any kind of change means a change toward imperfection. You follow that? God can't be immutable.
Or that you're influenced by others' impression of perfection or imperfection.
Excellent. I believe impassible. The idea that God is not influenced by others. Because you're right. If you have everything, the outside world can't impact you in any way. You have to be all strong. You have to be all knowing. And you have to be everywhere. Unlimited. That's one view of perfection. Let me ask you, is that the biblical view of perfection?
I don't think it's a biblical statement. I think it's a biblical impression that we have imposed on it.
Other thoughts about that?
Perfection is a myth.
What's that?
So perfection is a myth.
Well, that's really good. It depends, like, how do we define perfection, right? How do we define perfection?
In the moment, right now, if you're talking about popular culture, the body structure of the Kardashians is perfect.
That's right.
But
That's exactly
in the
right. No, that's right. This is good.
But and people go pay to get that. Okay, so perfection is something that we only define when we're wanting to compare it to something else and use it in my thought process. When we focus on perfection, we're focusing on a way to isolate a few people as perfect and demonstrate the majority is imperfect. So it's a momentary thing. What's perfect today, what was perfect to Raphael was not necessarily perfect to, I don't know.
Yeah.
Stieglitz, but I mean, he did a lot of people. So Stieglitz,
Right.
or Edward Hopper, who did a lot of skinny people.
Right, right. So our question then is, we have to think about what a biblical depiction of perfection is. Because I think that God is really trying to model what it means to be good. Does that follow? Can we agree upon that? So when Jesus says in Matthew 5, be perfect as my Father in heaven is perfect, right? If we have an image of divine perfection like this, that's problematic, yeah? No, and in addition, what does God, when God creates humanity in Genesis 1, what does God create humanity in? God's image. It's God's image. That's right. And if this becomes the nature of the image, then we have problems. You follow? So for Aristotle and Plato, these things in particular were reflected in human reason, yes? And the rational man, I'm using that pronoun intentionally, was the virtuous man. Because to them, the capacity to reason is what set us apart from the plants and the animals, all that. And that makes sense, right? That makes sense. Of course, this causes problems when you start encountering humans that may have disabilities, something like that. Does that mean they image God less? But then what happens is, why did I emphasize man? For Aristotle, human reason was broken up into two parts and then a third. One part was contemplative wisdom. This is the capacity to understand themes and ideas. Triangleness, 3 sides, 3 angles, 180 degrees, right? It never changes. Financial solvency, yeah? Having more income than costs. Having a fund for emergencies. Dave Ramsey fans out there, you know, trying to pay off your debts as quickly as possible. Active wisdom is the capacity to act on this. I know with my salary as a college professor, I shouldn't buy the new pickup truck, especially these days, even though I really want one. Yes, that's not financially solvent. And so the deliberative element is what makes these. I know what to do, and a deliberative element of my mind is strong enough, I will not do it, or I will do what I know I need to do. You follow? Guess what? According to Aristotle and Brendon, naturally born with a defective deliberative element. I kid you not. But here's the thing, this has impacted our consciousness for 2,400 years. You know what I mean? They're unable, they know what's right? You go to the mall, and you see that really cute dress, and you know you shouldn't get it, but you get it anyway, right? Which means that what does every woman need to make sure that she is along the right path? Please trust me, I don't believe this, okay? I need to make this really clear. Okay, but yes, what does a woman need? A man, that's right. And that man needs to sit down with her every Sunday afternoon and plan out her week for her and give her allowance and help her figure things out. This stuff is still taught. You understand that? This stuff is still taught. And people who are teaching it think it comes from the Bible. It's not coming from the Bible. It's coming from Greek theology. You get it? It's coming from Greek theology. And people like Origen, early church father, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, they all picked up on it. They had love affairs with Aristotle and Plato. I mean, they loved them. And they did everything they could to try to jam the Bible into that philosophical construct. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And it continues to impact the way we read. Now, let me be clear with this. This is God as a category, God as a being, God as a thing, could be all of these things. Make sense? But I think the Bible tells us that God has chosen not to be all of these things for the purpose of being able to engage in relationship with humanity. You follow that? That makes sense? This is threatening. I mean, just as much as the flood probably wasn't the worldwide flood, right? There was a lot of flooding in the ancient world, especially in Mesopotamia. Just as much as that could be a threat, I'm driving with my parents in Florida, and my 13-year-old, God bless him, says, oh gosh, why? You know, Grammy and Pop-Pop, I don't think the flood really happened. I mean, like, that evokes fear. Because if their grandson doesn't believe the flood happened, as it's depicted in the Bible, he's going to hell. You know what I mean? He kept pushing back. It's like, so, what are we having for dinner? Do you know what I mean? Just as much as the historicity of the text can't get in the way of our reading, so too does these divine perfections not get in the way of our reading. And it's really, so this is what we're going to begin to do, and I know I need to start wrapping it up here. We're going to look at context of Genesis 1 through 3, a little bit of the context of Genesis 6 to 9, to help us better understand the period out of which they emerged. This is a historical critical method of reading. We'll also take a confessional approach, a canonical / confessional approach. And I don't think the two conflict. Too often people say you can't take a historical critical and a confessional. I think actually historical critical actually makes the confessional reading much more rich. And then, as Mike says, books within books, and each of these books have multiple authors. We're going to take a look at sources, right? And is there evidence in the text that they were written by different people? And if there is, which there is, for example, in Genesis 1, humanity was created at what stage of creation? Is that?
Depends on which Genesis.
Genesis 1, yeah, Genesis 1. Last day, right? Well, not last day, sixth day. Sixth day, good. Genesis 2, humanity was created when? Yeah, that's right. The man was created, and then the garden was planted. The man was put in that garden, and then the animals were created and brought to the man, and then the woman was created, yes? Right. In Genesis 1:26, 1:27, male and female were created at the same time. So it's clear evidence. This is clear evidence of different authors. Follow? Which means, for one, we can think about what those authors were struggling with within their context and get the divine message from that. And for another, we can read them together. Relationship, dialogue. That's at the core of the biblical text. The Bible itself is doing that. Let me show you one more passage. Oh, this is fun. This is the transition. That's what I have to do to see. Isn't that fun? That's okay. This is the transition from Genesis 6 to Genesis 7. I'll show this. Get that quickly. Anybody notice anything strange?
Seven pairs, 2 pairs.
2 pairs and 6, 7 pairs and 7. So there's 2 explanations for that. One is the Bible used to read from Genesis 5 to 6 to 8 to 9. And Noah brought in 2 pairs of every kind. When they got off the ark, he was really happy. He took a cow and he wanted to sacrifice to God. And he killed one of those cows and made a great sacrifice to God. And then he's looking at the sacrifice and he's going, oh my gosh. No. And then he goes, God, rewinds the whole story. God tells him, okay, bring 7, now we're set. And then he gets off the ark and sacrifices the cow and everything's okay. You get that? Or it's just 2 different authors, 2 different versions blended together by editors who had such a high value for the text that they couldn't discard either or. You follow that? Yeah. Does that make sense? You're all well informed, I know.
Make sure you mention that.
Yes, okay. Look at this, Mike. Oh, man. Okay. These articles are on the website, right?
Yeah.
Provided. I know you're all busy. These are short articles, great chapters out of Mark Retliff's book, who used to teach Hebrew Bible at Brandeis, Jewish scholar. Very thoughtful ideas to read. You'll notice Genesis 1 through 3 appears every time. Meditate on the text, yeah? Try to find these, what we call fractures in the text. Statements that seem to conflict with one another. Follow? Then ask yourself, how do you resolve those conflicts? Yeah? How can we theologically think through these things? If we believe that the Bible is God's word, there's this interesting phenomenon where these Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3 are standing in dialogue with one another. And if God is a relational God, then the actual structure of the Bible reflects God's image, insofar as it's communicating with each other, with itself. I think it's really calling us to communicate with them. Does that make sense? One is not claiming to be right over the other. All right. So in next week, we're going to look at the historical context of Genesis 1 and try to better understand the message, the intended message of the author. And we'll begin to work through how then in week 3, Genesis 1 can be read and parallel with Genesis 2 and 3 in spite of their differences. And then in the 4th week, we'll look at John 20 and its relationship to 1 through 3 and 6 to 9. Make sense? Any thoughts or questions?
If you didn't sign in, please do so.
Yes.
Before there was a statement that God allows sin, I struggle with that. God allows and has given us free will. Sins range from taking an ashtray from your favorite restaurant to mass murder. I don't believe God allows sin. I believe God allows individuals to make really hard decisions. So I struggle with the idea when people say, well, God allows sin or pain or suffering that's outside of a medical issue. What kind of God is that? I don't feel like God allows sin. I feel like God is unable, having given us free will, to prevent us from this.
So yeah, God chooses to not intervene. Is that fair to say?
I don't know that the person who is plowing through Ukraine has any interest in the teachings of God. And so I don't know how God stops people.
Yes, and I think, what was your name back there? Sorry, you said God is us.
Yes.
I think in some ways then that's where God appears, right? It's us being present to intervene, right? It's us being present to intervene. I think that's something we should keep in mind for the next couple of weeks, particularly as we re-envision the image of God in humanity and what it means for God to appear, show up in our presence. Does that follow?
Because it's such an easy, well, I mean, it is something people say, well, COVID, God allowed it. We've created the biological, environmental, entomological reasons that it happened. God isn't responsible for that.
So humans were failing at their capacity to presence God and help push back on that.
Yes, which is very different than God permits sin, in my interpretation.
Okay. That's fair, yeah. What do you think? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know all the answers, obviously, human, but I think God, he didn't create robots, he gave us free choice. And sometimes people's free choice is pretty long. You may try and stop it, you may try and work with people, change the situation. Make us not do bad things. I agree.
In the prophetic tradition, quickly, it's God speaking to the prophet, right? God acting, and the prophet saying, you need to choose. It's 90% directed towards social justice, the prophetic voice. You need to treat people better. If you don't, your society is going to fall apart. And the Babylonians, the Assyrians are going to come get you. So that's, God calls humans to act the way we should be acting. And when we do not, these things happen. Thoughts? All right. Did I sell you?
Yeah.
Still on board? But I love what you said. I don't have all the answers. That's what I tell my class. This is my reading. This is my reading. I know I'm right about this. I know I'm right about the Greek influence on our Bible and how horrible it's been. It's led to the subordination of women, the subjugation of the other. Like slavery in America, I have Benjamin Palmer from First Presbyterian in New Orleans. You look at some of his speeches and sermons, and it is all Aristotle. And it's talking about the African human being doesn't have rational capacity to guide their own lives. And God has put it upon us. I know it is not easy, but God has put it upon us to be the benevolent master. Because if we do not enslave these people, then they will run wild to their demise. That's what they said. That's what Aristotle said. And then they used the Bible to justify it. And then when the South lost the Civil War, Paul returned to the Tower of Babel. You know what he said? Forget about what I was saying before, but God intended what? Remember what happens at the end of the Tower of Babel? People go their own ways. God intended segregation. You know, it's crazy. So these are my ideas. I know I'm right with this, but the rest of it, we just wrestle with together. You know what I mean? Israel means God will contend, or I have wrestled with God, or he has wrestled with God, something like that. So that's what we're called to do. All right. I've already kept you on time. Thank you all.